I'm going to rank all 36 gaming laptops that I tested this year using this tier list. The way it works is simple. There are 7 different tiers, with F down the bottom being the worst and S up the top being the best. I've got all the laptops that we're going to rank on the right hand side, and although only 15 can show at a time, don't worry, I've got the full 36 there. And if any of these laptops go on sale, we'll be sure to add them to our new website. So be sure to check that out regularly to get the best deal on your next gaming laptop. Otherwise, you can check out current prices for all of these laptops with the links below the video. Alright, just some quick disclaimers before we start ranking laptops. This video is not sponsored by anyone. Everything here are my own thoughts and opinions based on testing these 36 laptops in 2022. Just because I might put something at the top in S tier does not mean that it's perfect. Nothing in life is. Everything's full of trade-offs. Something that works amazingly well for one person might be terrible for another, and vice versa. Everyone's got different needs, and ultimately, you're going to have to come to a conclusion yourself based on this information. So obviously, as a result, all of these rankings are going to be completely biased based on my own thoughts and opinions after testing these laptops. So if I rank something low, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't buy it. And if I say that the laptop that you have sucks, just relax. Again, these are just my thoughts and opinions. They can't hurt you. I'm also probably going to end up reordering some of the laptops as we go through the list, because I might get to one laptop that I think needs to sit differently based on things I've already put in place. So I guess you're just gonna have to watch the whole video. Alright, let's get into it. Alright, so we've kind of got the laptops in alphabetical order, but it's not perfect. So first up is Acer's Helios 300. Now, this year they did actually do a complete redesign of this laptop, and it's actually got a light bar on the front now, so obviously straight to S tier. Alright, but seriously, I think this one is definitely at least an A. I actually gave last year's version of the Helios an E rating, because it was just so bad in so many different ways, but this year's model has fixed pretty much every issue that I had. This year's version has a MUX switch now, so you can disable Optimus and get better FPS in games, a higher GPU power limit, which again equals better FPS, a better screen, 2 sticks of memory, Type-C charging, a better camera, Intel 12th gen offers pretty big gains over 11th gen, bigger battery with bigger battery life, and there are more small changes than that. The only minor thing I didn't like was that the touchpad did feel a bit loose sometimes, but I'm not sure if that was just my unit. It did only have one Type-C port, which might be a bit limiting, and its crazy boot sound was just obnoxious, but at least you can turn that off. I've actually seen this laptop for about $1,000 US on sale for the RTX 3060 and i7-12700H, which is actually pretty crazy. There really just isn't that much to complain about this laptop, and I know I was joking about S tier at the start, but I think the Helios 300 this year actually deserves it. It's just come so far, and it's actually a really good laptop that I can easily recommend. Again, just to be clear, we are talking about the new 2022 model here, and not the older 2021 or 2020 versions, which were quite a lot worse. Alright, next up is Acer's Nitro 5. Now, the Nitro series is meant to be a bit more of a budget-friendly gaming laptop, so it tends to be the tier below the Helios. And like the Helios, Acer also basically completely redesigned the Nitro chassis this year, and again, it has plenty of improvements, including also getting a MUX switch, again, a higher GPU power limit. Mine also had 2 sticks of memory again, unlike the single channel versions of last year. This year's had Type-C charging, and again, it gets the update to Intel 12th gen, which just has very big gains over older CPUs. Now, the Nitro 5 is also available with an AMD Ryzen configuration, which is something that the Helios does not offer. And generally speaking, AMD Ryzen does seem to give better performance on battery and better battery life. So if those are important to you, then you might want to consider the AMD version. Now, although there were some nice improvements with the Nitro 5, it is still meant to be a more budget-friendly gaming laptop. And in order to hit lower price targets, sacrifices have to be made somewhere. Although it has a 1080p 144Hz screen, it is lower quality in that it's not that bright. The screen response time is on the slower side, and the color gamut isn't amazing. It's also one of the few laptops that still has a 2.5-inch drive bay inside, which means not enough room for a bigger battery. I also thought the fans were a bit loud, and the screen hinge was a little wobbly. I've also actually seen it for a similar price to the Helios 300, which doesn't really make sense. If you can get the Helios 300 with the same specs as the Nitro 5 on sale, it absolutely makes sense just to get the Helios. It's way better. Now, last year I did give the Nitro a D, but it has got some nice improvements this year, so I think we'll start off and just go one level higher with a C. So right in the middle of the 7 options. I think it's a pretty decent mid-range, more budget-friendly gaming laptop this year, and yeah, it does have some nice improvements over last year, but there are still those things holding it back from me putting it higher, which is just kind of necessary in order to keep the lower price. Alright, next up we've got Alienware's X14R1. So this is Alienware joining the 14-inch gaming laptop gang, along with ASUS's Zephyrus G14 and Razer's Blade 14. Personally, I quite like this laptop. It just felt really thin and portable, and although it is thinner than those other two 14-inch laptops I mentioned, in order to get it thinner, it ends up being wider and deeper. But still, I don't know, there was just something about it that just made me feel like it was easy to pick up and carry around. It actually had surprisingly good battery life for an Intel-based gaming laptop. Based on my own testing, generally speaking, AMD does better in that regard, but this one did quite well. Unfortunately for it, those other two 14-inch gaming laptops are AMD Ryzen based, so those do end up having better battery life than this. But Intel 12th Gen has more cores and threads, so this does end up performing better in CPU workloads. I was originally considering giving this a B, but I think it has a few downsides as well, which end up putting it as C tier. First off, it's got soldered memory and cannot be upgraded, so you're stuck with whatever you get. Secondly, it's got a lower GPU power limit. I found my 3060 would run between 50 and 75 watts, which again is to be expected with that thinner design. I also had some issues where the laptop would blue screen, but it was only happening when it was running on battery power, which is a bit weird. Now, Dell/Alienware have actually contacted me since I put my review out, and they mentioned that this has been fixed in a driver update. I don't have the laptop anymore, so I can't test and confirm that, but they seem pretty confident that that's fixed. Still though, driver update or not, Alienware's/Dell software just really isn't great. Along with Gigabyte, I think they're right down the bottom just in terms of their control panel and software quality experience. In my opinion, Alienware/Dell just need to remake their software from the ground up. They've obviously just added too much over time, and it's just too clunky and there's too many bugs, too many problems. I've ranted about this plenty in my reviews. Overall, I do like the X14, but I think there are some negatives holding it back, so yeah, we'll go with C for now. Alright, next up is Alienware's X17R2, which is a 17-inch gaming laptop. Now, like most other Alienwares, it does tend to be on the thinner side. Now, a thinner gaming laptop might sound good, but I just don't really see the reason why they're trying to go for the whole thin angle with this design. So this is a 17-inch gaming laptop. Even if it's thin, it's going to be quite big in terms of width and depth still. You can't change that in order to fit the 17-inch screen. But because they still want to offer high levels of performance, they've put 4 fans inside, which is actually quite an interesting design, and it does work pretty well. But in order to actually fit that, they have to make the laptop wider and deeper. So although it is on the thinner side, it ends up being pretty big still and less portable. I also found that the back edge just felt sharp, so when you're holding the laptop and walking around, after like 30 seconds, it felt like it was going to cut my fingers off. So yeah, just really not portable despite being thin, which I think is the whole thing they were going for. And of course, if they did go a little thicker, then they would have been able to boost the power limits and give it better performance. Now, it did do pretty well in games compared to other laptops, but in terms of like raw CPU performance, it wasn't quite as high. It was often performing worse compared to other laptops with the same CPU that cost far less money. Obviously, in typical Alienware fashion, it's not cheap. The battery life also wasn't amazing, but the performance on battery wasn't too bad for an Intel gaming laptop. It does have the cool looking RGB light ring on the back, but you're not really going to see that as you're going to be sitting in front of the laptop when you're using it. So it's kind of just there if you want to flex on people walking by. Or I guess for when you get up to get a drink of water or something and you see that RGB light bar and you think to yourself, oh yeah, I've got an Alienware. I'm sure that's what everyone does. And again, just like I mentioned with that smaller X14 just before it, Alienware's software just is kind of garbage in my opinion. I kind of wanted to go D on this one, but I mean, it is still a pretty decent gaming laptop. So despite its negatives, I think we're going to go for C for now. All right, next is Apple's MacBook Pro, which strictly speaking isn't really a gaming laptop. But that said, you can definitely game on the M1 Pro chip, especially if games are natively designed for it. Though game support is definitely hit or miss, and it's nowhere near as good as Windows or even Linux. Although the screen does look pretty good in terms of brightness and colors, the screen response time was pretty slow at lower than 20 milliseconds, so it's not going to be a good experience for competitive titles. As I'm sure everyone knows, Apple laptops also just cost a lot of money, so unless you're getting it for some other task like video editing, it just doesn't make sense to consider in terms of a gaming laptop by itself. You're going to be better off with pretty much any other gaming laptop in this video if your goal is is gaming. So with that in mind, it's gotta be at least an E, right? Actually, I guess I did just say literally get any other laptop than this if the goal is gaming, so let's go to F. Alright, next up is the ASUS Flow X16. Now, this was that laptop where you could fold the screen around and basically use it as a tablet. They had the 13-inch Flow X13 last year, which was pretty interesting, and now this is basically a bigger version of that. And bigger does also mean more GPU power. So this one went up to RTX 3070 Ti graphics, which is pretty crazy when you consider that it's basically a tablet, which you can of course also use as a normal laptop. Not only that, but if the inbuilt graphics aren't enough, you can also attach the ASUS XG Mobile with direct PCIe connection, so an eGPU setup, which does mean that this laptop gets a level of upgradability that most gaming laptops can only dream of, because the discrete graphics, whether from Nvidia or AMD, are almost always soldered to the motherboard and cannot be upgraded. So although we're not upgrading the graphics inside the laptop, as long as ASUS keeps making the XG Mobile, which they've been doing for more than 2 years now, in theory it should be possible to upgrade down the line with, say, RTX 40 series. So yeah, definitely quite interesting. No surprises though, to get all those extra features, it does not come cheap. But at the same time, no one else is really offering this sort of solution. And I'm not just talking about the eGPU thing, because other companies do technically allow that with Thunderbolt. Of course, the direct PCIe connection with the X16 is much faster than Thunderbolt, as I've shown in a previous video. But yeah, the whole 3070 Ti thing in a foldable tablet, no one else is doing that. So yeah, if you do want that design, I guess you've got to pay, and ASUS is really the only option right now. So I mean, with that in mind, if you are someone that needs the most powerful gaming tablet ever, then for you this would be S tier, because it's literally the best option you can get. But for most people, I think this probably makes more sense as a B. I think it's really cool what they were able to do here, and it's great to see ASUS doing new designs like this. Alright, I know I've got the ASUS Zephyrus G15 next, but I want to talk about that closer to the G14. So let's do the ASUS Scar 15. Now last year I gave the Scar 15 a C, and honestly this year I'm pretty sure it's basically the exact same laptop, with the only difference being of course that they upgraded it to the latest CPU and GPU, which do definitely give it a nice performance boost. But yeah, this does still mean that there are negatives there, like the fact that it doesn't have a camera at all, and that RGB light bar on the front, as cool as it looks, in order to actually open the bottom of the laptop, you have to be careful when pulling it up and take out some ribbon cables, and it's possible that I might have forgotten about that and just taken the bottom panel off at some point, and those cables ripped straight out of the motherboard and I broke the RGB. So if that's something that I can do, it's definitely something that you can do. I think it's an outdated design considering other gaming laptops like MSI and Lenovo also have plenty of RGB light bars, and none of them have that whole ribbon cable situation. So I hope ASUS fixes that in future. I get that they can't redesign every single laptop chassis every year, but yeah, they have used this same model of Scar for at least a couple of years now. So yeah, I really want to see them refresh that in 2023. It did also perform basically the same as Alienware's X17R2 next to it with the same GPU. But all things considered though, I do think the Scar is a better laptop than that Alienware. The software is just nowhere near as annoying as what Dell has, and yeah, it doesn't cost as much. I think I might move this one to B. It could definitely stay as C, just like I had it last year, but if I'm being honest, I think I might have underestimated it last year. I think it's a pretty good gaming laptop. I think B is pretty fair. Alright, next up is the ASUS Scar 17 Special Edition, or SE. So this was basically their Scar 17 laptop that when Intel's 16-core 24-thread HX processors came out, they basically dumped one of these in here and it became their top-end laptop for 2022. So basically this is the most powerful ASUS laptop of the year that I'm aware of. So it's no surprise that its CPU performance is crazy. This gaming laptop had the best single and multi-threaded CPU performance out of any gaming laptop I've ever tested so far. And unlike others, like MSI's GT77 Titan, they didn't need to make it super big or anything. It's just a regular 17-inch gaming laptop size. I mean, it's not particularly thin or anything, but have you seen the GT77? It's pretty massive. So despite desktop replacement grade hardware, it keeps the regular laptop form factor, which I definitely appreciate. Mine had a 1080p 360Hz screen, which I think is a bit of a waste for a 16-core CPU and RTX 3080 Ti graphics, but it is of course available with other options like 1440p 240Hz that probably make more sense, especially at 17 inches. I don't know about you, but if I have a 1080p screen, I can actually notice the pixels. 1080p at 15 inches is still okay for me, but yeah, 17 inches, I want at least 1440p. Again, just like the Scar 15 that I mentioned, it's got that RGB light bar on the front, but with the older design that has those ribbon cables that you awkwardly need to pull off, so not great. But I guess as long as you know about it, you're only probably going to open your laptop once, maybe twice to upgrade. It's not as if you're opening it every other day, so maybe it's not the end of the world. I also found that the touchpad was a little loose, though that was probably just my unit, and also the screen hinges a little loose if I recall, but again, could just be my unit, not too sure. Honestly, I think this is a step above the Scar 15, so I think this is going to be our first A. I mean, it's in the name. The Scar 17 is basically a bigger version of the Scar 15, but this is the SE, the special edition, and they put that new CPU in there, and they did some other changes. I can't actually remember the details. It might be like a vapor chamber cooler and some other bonuses. I remember being pretty impressed with it. Definitely not for everyone, but if you do need power in a machine that's not super crazy big, it's one to look at. Alright, next up is the ASUS TUF A15, and this one has come a long way since when it first came out in 2020, and Hardware Unboxed were cutting the bottom panel open with a Dremel to give it more airflow. The 2021 model last year did have some nice improvements, but the 2022 model this year just takes things to a whole nother level. This year they added a mux switch, they boosted the GPU power limit. Mine had an RTX 3060 and it was the max 140 watt version, and it was one of the best 3060s that I tested, and that combined with the mux switch will boost gaming performance. They also improved the thermals. It had excellent battery life, though kind of like the Nitro 5 that I put in C tier, the 1080p 144Hz screen wasn't great. The screen response time was just on the lower side, though to be fair, you can definitely get the A15 with different screen options. That was just the one that I happened to buy it with. I should also note that this A15 was the AMD Ryzen version. ASUS do also sell it with an Intel CPU, which I'm pretty sure is just the TUF F15, and as far as I'm aware, it's the exact same laptop, it's just that it has the Intel CPU, which will obviously change things. Based on my own testing, generally Intel seems to perform better both in games and other workloads, but generally speaking, AMD seems to last longer on battery and perform better when running on battery power. Unfortunately, I didn't get the F15 this year, so I can't talk about the Intel model, but yeah, this AMD model, I was quite impressed with it. Now, last year I gave the TUF A15 a D, but this year I'm thinking either an A or a B. Seriously, it's come that far. Now, I know the Scar 15 is probably a better gaming laptop, but the A15 is meant to be like a more mid-range option. And in terms of that and just how far it's come, I think it is worth the A. I did actually do a recent video where I compared the TUF A15 to Lenovo's Legion 5, which I gave an S2 last year, and this year I thought the TUF was very close to the Legion 5. So yeah, if the Legion 5 comes in and gets an S or an A, I think the TUF at least deserves an A. So let's leave it there for now and move on. Alright, next up is the ASUS Flow Z13, which is another of ASUS's unique designs that no one else is doing. So while the Flow X16 could be used as a tablet by completely folding the screen 360 degrees around, it keeps the keyboard on it. Now the Z13 on the other hand, you can just detach the keyboard and use it as a tablet like that. So it's more of a true tablet. So despite it being a relatively thin 13-inch gaming laptop slash tablet, it still has Intel's Core i7-12700H with 14 cores, 20 threads inside. Not to mention up to NVIDIA RTX 3050 Ti graphics. So on the lower side in terms of discrete graphics, but I mean it is a 13-inch tablet, come on. You can definitely play modern games at low to medium settings, no problem at all. But also like the Flow X16, it's got ASUS's XG Mobile port, so you can connect that XG Mobile eGPU with direct PCIe connection for even faster gaming performance. I'm pretty sure when I originally reviewed the Z13, I had the RTX 3080 eGPU. So yeah, basically it performed like a gaming laptop with 3080 graphics, despite being a 13-inch tablet. Again, just like the X16, it's a really unique design that a lot of other companies don't really seem to be doing this year. It only seems to be ASUS trying new things, which I definitely appreciate. If anything, it keeps the content interesting. As it is on the smaller side, it does mean there are less upgrade options. That's just one of the trade-offs of having a smaller machine. Though again, in theory, as long as ASUS keep making the XG Mobile, I mean, there's no reason you couldn't buy like a 4080 version next year or whatever they come up with and upgrade that way. So despite being a smaller 13-inch model, technically it still kind of gets more upgradability in the GPU department compared to any other bigger laptop. But yeah, you are definitely paying a huge premium in order to get these powerful specs in such a small device. This machine is not cheap. It's definitely not for everyone, but for those that do want a small portable tablet, I mean, I could see those people putting this in S tier, but I don't think that represents everyone. I think for now, I'll put it in B along with the Flow X16 for similar reasons, that it's just a cool, unique laptop that offers a lot of great features that other companies haven't even considered doing. You can absolutely get far cheaper gaming laptops that will outperform it. It just depends on what you want out of a laptop, I suppose. But yeah, for those that need a tablet that can also game, this is it. Alright, next up we've got the ASUS Zephyrus Duo 16, which is yet another unique ASUS design. What makes this one special is that it's got 2 screens, and pretty much no other laptop is doing that right now. I know HP experimented with something a year or two ago where they had this little tiny screen below the main screen. I mean, compared to the Duo, there's no competition. This has a full, wide screen underneath the main screen, and it's actually pretty cool. It's great for multitasking, like if you're gaming, you can run your game on the main screen and stick something like Discord down the bottom. And there are also some games like Dying Light 2 that have built-in support specifically for this laptop, so you can have your game running on the main screen and then have things down the bottom that are specific to the game, like menu options and other stuff. But yeah, that game was specifically updated to support the Duo 16, so I don't think there are a whole lot of laptops that have native support for it. It's not quite as simple as just running whatever game you like and putting menu options and stuff, like say a mini map down onto the bottom screen, because the way Windows sees it is just basically 2 different monitors. So think dual monitors in Windows. And in most games, you can't just drag the game over 2 screens. So it doesn't quite work like that. But yeah, still pretty cool. And the way that second screen works is that when you open the lid with the main screen, the bottom screen folds up, and that also allows air to get in below that screen and improve cooling. So yeah, an interesting design that has more than one function. Again, as you'd expect, unique design equals higher cost, but this is going to be more of a niche laptop. I think it really depends on whether or not you want 2 screens, sorry. I mean, you can of course have whatever laptop you like and have a 13, 14, 15-inch portable screen that you just connect with USB Type-C. But that's something extra that you've got to carry around. Just having the screens built into your main laptop that's always with you, I can definitely see that appealing to a number of people. It also has some nice improvements compared to last year's smaller Duo 15. The most important to me was that the Duo 15 last year had soldered memory, while the Duo 16 does not, so it's more upgradable as well now. I did have some strange problem when reviewing it. The CPU power limit of the AMD Ryzen 9 6900HX, I think it just seemed to be lower for some reason. I'm not really sure why. Now, if you run games at say 4K or 1440p resolutions, the performance was perfectly fine, but at the lower 1080p resolution, I did find that the lower CPU power limit could negatively affect gaming performance, and I'm not actually sure if ASUS has fixed that. I was meant to get the Duo 16 back so that I could check it out, but they didn't end up sending it back. As far as I know, it was fixed in an update, but yeah, I haven't been able to confirm. It's kind of weird because it was only a problem with both the CPU and GPU running at the same time, so like in a game. But if you just run a CPU only workload, the CPU performance was actually next level, at least as far as AMD's 8-core 16-thread CPUs go, because Intel 12th gen laptops with more cores and threads still do generally perform better, but compared to other AMD laptops, it was a top performer. So yeah, another of ASUS's interesting designs. It is a pretty cool laptop. I think it's got to go at least B. Maybe I would consider A if it definitely had that fixed weird bug with the CPU power limit and the GPU running. I'm pretty sure it's fixed. I don't know, I think we'll put it B for now with ASUS's other unique designs like the Z13 and X16. Alright, next let's check out the ASUS Zephyrus G14, which is their smaller 14-inch gaming laptop design. So basically ASUS's version of Alienware's X14R1, which was also a 14-inch model. Though the Alienware had Intel CPU and NVIDIA graphics, while the G14 this year is all AMD, so AMD CPU and AMD Radeon GPU, which is also a first for the G14 because prior to now it's been NVIDIA graphics and AMD CPU. Now this year's G14 has a number of improvements over last year's, including the addition of a mux switch, which again lets us disable Optimus and boost FPS in games. It's got a larger touchpad, which is just nicer to use. The speakers sound better. They added a micro SD card slot. There's a vapor chamber cooler now. They added a camera this year, and there's more CPU and GPU power than older models, which equals better performance. It does cost more money to get these extra features though, and I'm pretty sure we featured last year's G14 on our GamingLaptop.tv deals website recently, and I'm pretty sure for the RTX 3060 it was less than $1,000, which is actually a pretty good price for a G14, as long as you don't need any of those features that I just listed, because that 2021 model does not have those. Now, I gave the G14 a C last year, but as I just mentioned, there are a number of improvements this year, so based on that, it's gonna at least be a B. And I do also think that it deserves to be ahead of Alienware's 14-inch model. I did list quite a few improvements though, and the G14 is a pretty impressive laptop, so I think I might actually go one higher and stick it in A. I think the G14 is a really good machine. The only thing I'd be aware of is the Radeon graphics rather than NVIDIA. I had the 6800S, which did perform pretty well, but I did have a couple of small issues that I mentioned in my review that seemed specific to drivers. But my initial review of this laptop was about 9 months ago now, so hopefully those things have been fixed. You can of course use AMD's FSR to boost gaming performance, but this was the only laptop we tested all year with Radeon graphics, so it can't use DLSS. All of the other laptops that do have NVIDIA graphics, on the other hand, can use both DLSS and FSR, so best of both worlds. If that's something that's critical to you, then yeah, maybe the G14 would be below the X14, but everything considered, I think the G14 is pretty good. Alright, next up is the ASUS Zephyrus G15. So as per the name, kind of think of it as a bigger G14, but with a 15-inch screen. Though unlike the G14, ASUS kept the AMD CPU and NVIDIA graphics on the G15, so the G15 does not have Radeon graphics like the smaller G14. So that means you still get both FSR and DLSS. Now, last year I gave the G15 a B, but this year's G15 does have some nice improvements. Again, like other ASUS laptops, these include the addition of a mux switch, higher power limits for the GPU, both of which will boost gaming performance, and they added a webcam this year. Like other ASUS Zephyrus laptops, it is limited to only one stick of memory. Some of it is soldered to the motherboard, though that was the case with the G14 too. You can get them with 16 gigs soldered to the motherboard, and I mean for gaming, if you put in a 16 gig stick, you've got 32 gigs, which is plenty, because I still think 16 gigs is a good sweet spot for gaming even today and going into the future. But yeah, the fact that you can go 32 gig, I don't think that's going to be a problem for gaming anytime soon. So although technically speaking it is less upgradable on the memory, I don't think it's going to be a problem in practice for almost everyone using it for gaming. For some reason, the CPU performance on battery was a little worse than last year's model, despite this having the newer Ryzen 9 6900HS CPU. Last year's had the 5900HS. It did perform better when plugged into the charger though, so it was just a weird thing where this year's was a bit slower when running on battery. All things considered though, I do think it is a nice improvement compared to last year's, which I rated as a B. So like the G14, I think this one's got to be an A. Alright, next up is the ASUS Zephyrus M16, which is kind of similar to the G15. Like, the physical chassis is literally exactly the same. If you have these laptops on your desk with the lid closed, I don't think you can tell which is which. They look the same. The main differences with the M16 though are that rather than an AMD Ryzen CPU, it uses Intel, and as per the 16 in the name, it's got a larger 16-inch screen, and it uses the taller 16:9 aspect ratio. So although the laptop is physically the same size as the G15, the screen looks bigger. And not only that, but the screen also does look nicer. It's got better color gamut, and I think also better brightness. Now, like last year's G15, I also gave last year's M16 a B, but given this also has those improvements that the G15 has, including mux switch and higher power limit, I think I've got to give this one an A as well. I kind of see these laptops as like two sides of the same coin. One's AMD and one's Intel, though the Intel one has a bigger screen for whatever reason. I really hope ASUS do a G16 next year and keep them the same, because that bigger screen does look nicer. Now, I did do a whole dedicated video comparing both of these laptops in depth, and my conclusion was basically that if you're just gaming, get the G15, because it performs a little better, despite having an AMD CPU, which I found pretty interesting, because when I compared AMD and Intel head-to-head in a fair CPU comparison video, generally speaking, Intel performed better. But yeah, in my game tests, the G15 was ahead of the M16. But that said, it wasn't that big of a difference, and it's definitely not a big enough of a difference that I should put the M16 down to a B. So yeah, I don't think there's enough of a difference to justify moving it, so I'll leave it as an A for now, alongside the G15. Alright, we finally got through all the ASUS laptops. Now on to the Dell G15. The G15 I had this year is the 5520 model, which is the Intel 12th gen CPU version, and not the AMD Ryzen version, which might be different. Now, last year I gave the G15 an A, and I thought it was really an excellent gaming laptop for the money. This year's version has a lot of similarities, but if you saw my video, I titled it something along the lines of the worst gaming laptop ever, which might have been a bit clickbaity, but I was just so frustrated after testing this laptop because we had like 30 blue screens over the course of 2 days, which is just beyond unacceptable. Now, I rant about the problems in depth in my review, but I think I was able to fix it by manually getting the latest Intel integrated graphics drivers from Intel's website and not using what Dell provided or the Windows update. This was a few months ago though, so I can only hope/assume that those updates from Intel have since made their way over to Dell and Windows Update, because there were a number of other people saying that they also had plenty of blue screens with the G15. Honestly, if that blue screen stuff was normal, it would go straight to F tier, but yeah, I was able to fix it, and you know, I know Dell have seen that video, so I would have to assume that for sure they have put that fix in place. Otherwise, apart from that, for some reason this year they removed one of the 2 M.2 slots. So although it's a 15-inch laptop and it still has the physical space for a second M.2 slot, the connector just isn't soldered to the motherboard, so you can only install one M.2 SSD. I don't know what they were thinking there. This year's G15 does have advanced Optimus though, so although last year's had a muck switch, you had to manually reboot to swap between Optimus on or off, and this year it happens automatically, which is a nice feature. So yeah, last year's was an A. I think even if the blue screens are fixed, I've got to at least bump it down a bit just for removing that M.2 slot. Like, that's just less upgradability for no reason at all. I really don't understand it. But yeah, again, if regular blue screens are still a thing, that thing's going straight to F tier. Alright, onto the second batch of 15 laptops, and starting out with the Electronics Max 15, also known as the Aftershock Vapor 15X here in Australia. Both are the same laptop, it's a Tongfang model, and both companies just resell it. Now, this was a thinner laptop design with i7-12700H and RTX 3060 graphics, and due to the thinner design, there was some thermal throttling. But that said, it was still one of the best performing 3060 gaming laptops I had. The screen was a bit meh with no overdrive mode, so we couldn't lower the screen response time. It also had poor battery life and no USB Type-C charging, which I think is a bit unfortunate in a laptop that's so thin and obviously designed to be portable. I think machines like that should just have Type-C charging, so then if you don't want to bring the bigger and more heavier power brick with you, you don't have to. It just would have been good to improve portability. Now, as a thinner design, it does cost more money to get those decent specs in a thinner space. That's just how tech works. Overall, I'm kind of thinking that it's similar to Dell G15 in terms of tier. Both of these have the same CPU and GPU and perform similarly. They both have some positives and negatives. So yeah, pretty decent laptop if you are after a thinner, more portable design. And if you're in Australia, you can get the Aftershock Vapor 15X for $50 off with the coupon code JaredStack. Alright, next up is the Electronics Mech 17 GP, also known as the XMG Neo 17 in Europe. So the Mech 17, I'm pretty sure they sell both Intel CPU and AMD Ryzen CPU, while in Europe at XMG, I think they only sell the AMD version. Now, what made this one unique is that it has liquid cooling support, so you can both improve performance and also reduce fan speed significantly, making it much quieter. Not only that, but the Intel options at XMG have a custom Prima BIOS, and that enables a bunch of custom tuning, and you can even change things like memory timings. And they even include special binned memory that can run at CL34, whereas most other DDR5 memory in 2022 runs at CL40. So yeah, some nice improvements there. And not just that, but the whole chassis was metal and just felt really nice. It was probably one of the better designed, better laptops in terms of build quality, I guess you would say, and just how it felt out of the other 17-inch laptops that I tested. I would say that it felt better than the SCAR 17 SE that I put in A. Not to mention it does have liquid cooling, and it's got a mechanical keyboard, which I personally did like typing on. Not just that, but the software is also pretty good. Just like the Max 15, it's a Tongfang chassis, and their software just gives you a lot of options that a lot of gaming laptops don't otherwise give you. Like, you get the option to customize CPU and GPU power limits to granular degrees. There's just all sorts of cool things that other laptops don't offer. So yeah, based on my comparison with the SCAR 17 SE, I think this has to at least also be an A. That just makes sense to me. And yeah, I think it is better than the laptops in B as well. I mean, other laptops like the Duo 16 are pretty cool, but do they have water cooling? No. Alright, next up is Gigabyte's Aero 16. Now, this is another one, like the MacBook, that obviously isn't strictly for gaming. It's a content creator first laptop, but I mean, you can get it with i9 CPU and up to RTX 3080 Ti graphics, so it is definitely capable of gaming. Now, the Aero 16 has a taller 16:10 screen and it's OLED, and it looks spectacular. Although the response time is very good, which is just part of OLED, unfortunately the the refresh rate is 60Hz. But that said, you can also get it with a 165Hz mini LED screen, which might be a better option for gaming. It's got an all-metal design, and I thought the build quality felt pretty nice. Though, as an all-metal design, the trade-off is that you can feel the heat build up in the laptop over time. So it feels warmer to the touch compared to a plastic laptop, because metal just conducts heat better. As it's a thinner design, it does have lower power limits, which in turn does mean lower performance. It's also got a significant lack of ports. For some reason, Gigabyte decided to get rid of pretty much everything except Type-C and give you an included dongle. But the dongle was just low quality. Like, you would put it in and it would move around heaps, and it just didn't sit in position very well. It just wasn't a good implementation. I feel like they tried to copy Apple without at least doing the good parts that Apple does. Like, if you bought a dongle from Apple, it's probably actually going to at least be decent quality. Now, I'm guessing not many people are actually buying the Aero 16 because I've seen it go on some pretty crazy sales lately. On my gaminglaptop.deals website right now, we've got the Aero 16 with 3070 Ti graphics listed for $1,300 US. All the other negatives aside with the Aero 16, we have to acknowledge that that's just a crazy price for those specs. But maybe there's a reason. The Aero 16 was difficult and frustrating for us to test. There are a number of software problems and other random bugs that we just didn't find in other laptops. Granted, this was quite a while ago, so it might have changed a bit with software updates, I can't say. It sounds like a steal at that price in terms of gaming performance, but yeah, my partner who did most of the testing, she was really pushing for F tier for the old Aero 16. She just found it less stable compared to other gaming laptops when running all of our testing. All things considered though, I think I'd give it an E rather than an F. It is one of the not so great laptops, let's just say, but I think there are other laptops that make more sense for F tier. Like the Aorus 17, for example, straight to F. This was a bit of a weird one. For whatever reason, Gigabyte are only selling this 17-inch laptop with a 1080p 360Hz screen. Now, as I mentioned before, I can see the pixels at 17 inches on a 1080p screen. I'm sure if you're just using it for gaming, it's probably fine, and maybe you won't notice. The first thing I thought when I heard 1080p 360Hz screen with no other options was, oh, obviously it's designed with esports in mind. And cool, if it is meant to be a esports gaming laptop, then yeah, that makes sense. I mean, obviously it won't appeal to everyone, but if that's the niche that Gigabyte wants to get in and, you know, corner the esports gaming laptop market, sure, by all means, go for it. There are just a few problems with their implementation. First, there's no mux switch, which means you can't disable Optimus, and I've shown in countless videos on this channel that by having the integrated graphics enabled in esports games in particular, you're going to lose a lot of performance in games. I mean, yeah, the feature does cost more money, but it's worth it if you're making an esports gaming laptop. And the Aorus 17 isn't exactly cheap, it should have a mux switch. The next thing is that although the screen is 360Hz, the response time wasn't great, and there was no overdrive mode, so it wasn't possible to improve it. I also tested this with the 3070 Ti and 3080 Ti graphics. Obviously the 3080 Ti graphics cost more money, but because it's only got a 1080p screen, the GPUs don't really get to stretch their legs, and they ended up performing very closely together in games. Basically meaning if you get the 3080 Ti version, you're essentially throwing money down the drain. For some reason, the CPU performance wasn't great. Although it's thicker and bigger compared to the Aero 16 just above it in E tier, the Aero 16 CPU could boost higher than the Aorus 17. And again, in esports games, you kind of need all the CPU performance you can get, so I don't understand why that wasn't allowed to boost higher. There are also other things like the Aero 16 just wasn't as stable, the software wasn't as great. Again, I suppose that could have improved with updates though, but there are other small annoyances like the secondary key functions not getting lit up. It's like they wanted to make an esports gaming laptop and then just conveniently forgot to do all the important things that would actually make it really good. So yeah, I'm giving it an F because I really don't think anyone should buy this laptop. I mean, realistically, you can still absolutely get this machine and play games on it and have a great time. So is this too harsh? I don't think so. It's just that basically everything else is better. Now, after the Aorus 17, Gigabyte did also bring out the Aorus 17X. And adding that X on the end of the model did actually improve quite a lot. So the main reason for the 17X, like when the ASUS Scar 17 Special Edition came out, it was their laptop that they did when they put the 16-core 24-thread Intel HX CPU in. So you get more CPU performance. For some reason, you still only get the 1080p 360Hz 17-inch screen. Again, I would have preferred a 14-inch option, but at least this time you do get a mux switch. So you can turn Optimus off and actually get better performance performance in games. It also has faster screen response time compared to the non-X version that I put in F tier. The problem is though, the actual panel in both of these Aorus 17X and non-X laptops is the exact same model. So they've obviously just applied an overdrive mode to the 17X and not given it to the 17. I don't see why they couldn't do that with a software update. It seems like they're just keeping it for the 17X to make it look like it's better. As mentioned, the 17X does have that HX CPU, so more cores and threads, so it is better in terms of single and multi-core performance. But as far as gaming goes, most games really aren't going to benefit going from 14 cores to 16 cores, so it's not a big deal. It does have better cooling in order to cater for that higher tier CPU though, but it's not all improvements. The battery life doesn't last as long, I guess because that HX CPU just needs more juice to run. I also noticed that the software wasn't as bad as the Aorus 17. Again, that could just be that it's improved over time. I still don't really think this is a laptop that most people should buy, unless you're really after a dedicated esports machine. And it does now do okay at that job compared to the non-X version. But yeah, I still think there are better options out there, especially for the money. So although better than the Aorus 17, I don't think it's a whole lot better. So I'm gonna go E tier, just one step ahead. Alright, next up is Lenovo's IdeaPad Gaming 3i. So the I on the end means that this is the Intel version. There is also the AMD configuration, but unfortunately we didn't get that this year. Now the IdeaPad series is kind of meant to be Lenovo's more mid-range budget-friendly option. So they've got the Legion series, which is more their high-end gaming range, and then the IdeaPad underneath that for less money. So out of what we've got so far, I think the closest thing to the IdeaPad is Acer's Nitro 5. However, I think Acer's Nitro 5 is actually better than the IdeaPad this year. Acer's Nitro 5 this year has some nice improvements like the muck switch, which is something that the IdeaPad does not have. Now last year, I definitely thought that the IdeaPad was a bit better than the Nitro 5, but now that Acer have completely refreshed the Nitro 5, I do think that it's ahead. The IdeaPad just hasn't kept up. Now to be fair, my IdeaPad did have a much better screen compared to the Nitro 5, but it was one of those weird configurations that you'd have to pay more money for to actually get, and I don't think most people buying the IdeaPad would actually spring for that better screen. And to be fair, I'm pretty sure you can also do the same thing on the Nitro 5. You can spend more money to get a better screen. So I don't think that point is enough to differentiate them. The IdeaPad is also a bit more limited in upgradability options. Although it has two M.2 slots for SSDs, the SSD that comes installed is the smaller size rather than the bigger one, so you're a bit more limited in what you can fit. The IdeaPad was a bit smaller and lighter compared to the Nitro though, so if you were after a more portable gaming laptop that you would primarily use for, say, school or work, but you wanted to do some gaming on the side, I think the IdeaPad could make more sense compared to the Nitro. But in terms of a gaming laptop that you're going to primarily be using for gaming, I do think the Nitro 5 is the winner. So yeah, IdeaPad is our first D tier. Next up is Lenovo's Legion 5. So last year, as mentioned previously, I did have this in S tier, as I thought it was basically the best mid-range gaming laptop that you can get. But I'm not quite sure that I want to do that again this year. I did actually do an entire video where I compared last year's 2021 Legion 5 with this year's 2022 model, and there wasn't that much improvement, which I mean is kind of fine. You don't want to break what's not broken. But the competition has kind of caught up, and I haven't seen the Legion 5 available for great prices just yet. Every time I've seen it, it's always too expensive. I also think the main reason that it didn't appear to be that much better compared to last year's version is because both last year and this year I had the AMD Ryzen version. Now I think in Cinebench, the 6800H in this year's model was only about 10% faster compared to the 5800H in last year's. If we were instead looking at the Legion 5i with Intel CPU instead of AMD, it would be a completely different story going from Intel 11th gen to Intel 12th gen, because Intel 12th gen just objectively delivered a much bigger performance boost to both single and multi-threaded performance. And I think last year I gave the Legion 5i either a B or an A. I think it was a B. So yeah, if I had the Legion 5i this year, it would probably be higher than that, maybe even an S. Another reason is both last year's and this year's Legion 5 had NVIDIA RTX 3060 graphics. And although the power limit was like 10 watts higher this year or something, the performance in games is extremely close together. Now that's not really Lenovo's fault, they're just using what NVIDIA has available, and NVIDIA didn't give us a refresh of the 3060 this year. Now that said, there was a Legion 5 last year with 3070 graphics, and NVIDIA did refresh that to 3070 Ti, and you can get the 3070 Ti in the Legion 5. So it's possible that if I had a 11th gen 3070 Legion 5 last year, and I was comparing it to a 12th gen 3070 Ti Legion 5 this year, I would have seen a much bigger improvement, and that might have made me more excited about it. I'm not sure. But yeah, for the AMD version, it just really wasn't that much better compared to last year. And considering last year's version is often cheaper, if you can still find it available, you might as well just get last year's version. Now, I also did a dedicated comparison between the Legion 5 and ASUS TUF A15. And in more cases than not, I actually thought the TUF A15 was the better laptop for most people. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Legion 5 was better in many cases. But I think for things most people care about, the A15 was actually a little ahead. Not to mention also cheaper. Like in terms of raw gaming performance, they both perform basically the same. The Legion does have some nice extra features like Advanced Optimus, but yeah, overall I think its features are too similar to the TUF A15, so I think this year I want to put it in A rather than S. I don't know, maybe I need a tier between A and S where the Legion 5 sits, but yeah, for now I think it's leaning more towards the A than the S. Or maybe the Legion 5 needs to be an S and I should move the TUF A15 to an S, but I don't think that sounds right, so I think I'll leave them both as an A for now. Now, something that I think does deserve an S is Lenovo's Legion 5i Pro. Last year I tested the Legion 5 Pro, which is the AMD Ryzen CPU version, and I did give that an S. And now this year I've got the Intel 12th Gen 5i Pro model. So not as good in terms of battery due to Intel compared to AMD, but as I've been saying throughout this video, Intel 12th Gen does offer better CPU performance when plugged into the charger. Now compared to the Legion 5, the 5i Pro has a better 16:10 screen, and also nicer build quality in my opinion. Unfortunately, it does have a bigger 300 watt power brick, but you can change that and get the 230 watt version. The main criticism I had of the 5i Pro in my review was right when it launched, and the RTX 3050 Ti configuration was $1,800 US, which is just a joke. But we've come quite a way in the last few months, and the 5i Pro has actually had some crazy sales. We've had it listed on the GamingLaptop.deal's website for $1,350 for the i7-12700H and RTX 3070 Ti graphics. So that's pretty crazy and definitely one to consider at that price. I don't think I've seen the Legion 5 go for sale for quite that low yet, at least with equivalent specs. So yeah, the 5i Pro this year, really good. It's tough to say which is better between the 5i Pro and Helios 300, which says something about what Acer have done to the Helios. I really wanted to compare those in depth in a dedicated video, but unfortunately Acer needed the Helios 300 back. It is possible that I could still do that comparison, it would just require a lot more editing as I wouldn't have both laptops side by side, so I guess let me know if you want to see that comparison. Alright, next up is Lenovo's Legion 7i, which is basically the higher tier version of the 5i Pro. And again, that I does mean that it has an Intel CPU, but you can also get an all AMD version with AMD CPU and AMD GPU, but this 7i has NVIDIA graphics. Now, last year I reviewed the Legion 7, which was the AMD version, though back then it had NVIDIA graphics rather than Radeon, and I believe I gave it an A, with the main reason being that the Corsair IQ software, which is what was used to control all of that RGB lighting, it would drain the battery life by a ridiculous rate, and you had to end up disabling it. It just wasn't a great user experience, so based on that, I dropped it down from an S to an A. But now this year it's gone, so I've definitely got to give it an S. This is a great gaming laptop. I mean, even if it sucked, I'd probably give it an S just because it's covered in so much RGB. I'm just joking, but seriously, the Legion 7i is really nice. Again, like the SCAR 17 SE, this uses Intel's new HX CPUs, so 16-core, 24-thread processor. It had decent thermals thanks to the vapor chamber cooler, but unfortunately, just like the Legion 5i Pro and Legion 5, there's no built-in fan control yet, which is a feature that I really want to see, but I believe you can do it with third-party software. And like the 5i Pro, it's also got a nice 16:10 screen. The performance on battery was a bit weak, which tends to be the case with those Intel 16-core laptops. I guess there's only so much power that laptop batteries can give those power-hungry CPUs. And again, as I said before, S tier does not mean perfect. Nothing is going to be perfect in every way. These are just what I think are the best this year so far. It's got some nice-to-have features compared to the 5i Pro, but nothing too critical. If the 5i Pro is a fair bit cheaper, then yeah, it probably makes more sense just to get that, unless you really want some specific feature to the 7i, like that crazy RGB lighting, or maybe the pressure-sensitive WASD keys. Alright, next up we've got Lenovo's Legion Slim 7i. So just like the Legion 7i before it, but slim, so a slightly thinner laptop, which results in it being more portable, but there are other compromises associated with that. For one, it doesn't have that 16-core HX CPU, but still, I think it had the 12700H. That's still a 14-core 20-thread chip. And despite it being an Intel CPU, the battery life was actually quite good. My Slim 7i had RTX 3060 graphics, and Nvidia's 3060 can run anywhere between 60 and 140 watts, and I found that the Slim 7i was right in the middle at 100 watts. So not too low powered, but not high powered either. And mine had a 15-inch 2560 by 1600 screen, and more pixels do need more GPU horsepower to run. But with features like FSR and DLSS, it was still able to run games pretty well at its native screen resolution. But that said, you could probably spend less money and get the lower quality 1920 by 1200 screen, and you'd get more FPS in games. This laptop was very difficult to get inside, and as a smaller machine, it only has one upgradable memory slot with some memory soldered to the motherboard. So already quite a few negatives that are going to put it behind the bigger brother Legion 7i. Personally, I actually prefer this laptop over that bigger, more feature-rich Legion 7i, because it's smaller and more portable, but still has quite a lot of power inside. When I use a laptop, it's because I actually need portability, so most of the time that would be travel, and I would prefer to travel with something smaller like the Slim 7i. It's still going to handle everything I need. But that's just me. I think this is a great machine, and I'm going to give it an A. But yeah, if you don't need that portability, I could definitely see it being more B tier. Although that said, I guess it's kind of thin and portable like the Electronics Max 15, and I do think that the Legion is a better laptop compared to that. So in that regard, I think it makes sense to have it as a tier above that one. Next up is MSI's Crosshair 15. So this was that all yellow gaming laptop that MSI did a collaboration with Rainbow Six. So this laptop has a lot of Rainbow Six design aesthetic. So if you're not a fan of that game, this laptop's probably automatically going to be F tier for you, especially if you don't like a yellow laptop. If you do like a yellow laptop, then hey, maybe it's an S tier for you. I don't want to entirely judge it just based on how it looks, but I mean, there aren't any other yellow laptops this year, so ultimately I think this is going to be a pretty big factor. If you don't like yellow, then you're probably not going to want it. Now, although I'm not personally a fan of yellow gaming laptops and it's not something I would want, it was kind of cool from a review perspective to see something a bit different and not just the same black box that turns up every week. Gaming performance with the RTX 3070 wasn't too bad, but it didn't have a mux switch, and the fans were always audible. And even when I put the laptop in different performance modes, with a workload running, the fans would always sound like they maxed out, so there's not really any point of having the lower performance modes. But I guess that could have been fixed in an update since I've tested it. I thought the port selection was pretty crap because it's got a USB 2.0 port in 2022. I mean, come on. How much money are we really saving here at this point? It's not as if this is even a particularly cheap laptop anyway. I don't know. I try not to let price be the guiding factor of all these rankings, but yeah, this Crosshair 15 definitely is overpriced. Right now, I checked today before filming this video, it goes for $1,350 US. And as I mentioned earlier, you can get the S-tier Legion 5i Pro with a higher tier 3070 Ti GPU for the same money on sale. And that's just a far superior laptop. So it kind of just makes the Crosshair 15 obsolete, so kind of F tier based on that. But yeah, I don't want to judge it based purely on the price. I do think that it has more going for it than the Aura 17 at least, so I think for now we'll stick it in E tier. I don't think it's a laptop people should buy, but I also don't think it's the worst. Next up is MSI's GE67HX. So as per HX in the name, this was one of those refreshes that was done when those Intel 16-core 24-thread HX processors came out, just like the SCAR 17 Special Edition and the Aura 17X. But what made this one unique compared to those others was for the first time it had a 1440p 240Hz OLED screen. Before that, I don't think I've seen OLED above 60 to 90Hz. So this was quite a surprise to see high refresh, decent resolution OLED in a gaming laptop, and it does look very nice. Not only that, but the screen response time was the lowest I've ever measured at like 0.6 milliseconds, which is just crazy. Of course, there are the usual downsides with OLED, like screen burn-in long term, but there is software that MSI provide to try and alleviate that. This thing had excellent gaming performance for a 3070 Ti laptop, but unfortunately it did have a fairly large and heavy 330 watt power brick. The key brightness was a bit dim, and for some reason I could not get the microphones to work. I tried everything in software, but it just didn't work. I think that's just my laptop though, because someone in my Discord server did buy this laptop and they said they were able to get it to work. Granted, I'm pretty sure they said that the volume was really low for some reason, so not sure if there's some sort of microphone driver issue going on with the G67, but at least they were able to get it to work. And if you do want to join my Discord server, the link is in the video description. Now, MSI do have other cheaper gaming laptops laptops that perform very similarly in games, like the GP66, which we'll get to soon. But the more expensive GE67HX does have extra features like that nice OLED screen I mentioned, and that RGB light bar on the front, which is definitely going to give it an FPS boost in games. I think I'm going to have to give this one an A. I kind of see it as on par to the Scar 17 SE in a number of ways, and I think it's better than what we've got in B, like the Scar 15, and I think it's better than the Duo, of course, unless you need those dual screens. Definitely better than the Dell. But yeah, this laptop had some of the best performance from any 3070 Ti gaming laptop I tested, and combined with that OLED screen, just a great gaming experience. Alright, next up is MSI's GF63. Now, technically this is the 2021 model, and I bought two of these this year to make my 1650 versus 3050 comparison. So it has an 11th gen 11400H CPU. I think MSI did actually refresh with a 12th gen CPU, but I've only seen it so far with Intel Arc graphics. And it would be kind of interesting to test Arc graphics to see how they compare against Nvidia, but unfortunately I don't have the 2022 version just yet, so we've got last year's model here. Now, this is the cheapest gaming laptop you can currently buy brand new, at least in the US on sites like Newegg. And as you might expect, you get what you pay for. The build quality of this thing is just atrocious. It's super flexible, and if you open the screen too far, the panel near the keyboard kind of lifts up and pops off. It's really not great, and I don't think it's going to hold up too well long term. The screen is also just crap. It's very dim, slow response time, and the colors don't look great. I've seen the minimum spec version with GTX 1650 graphics go for $500 brand new, which is kind of crazy for a brand new gaming laptop. The RTX 3050 version is more like $750, which doesn't really make sense to me. By the time you're spending that amount on a 3050 gaming laptop, there are just better options available for less money, like HP's Victus 16. You can absolutely run modern games at low settings on the GF66 and have a good time on a budget. I just find it difficult to recommend unless you've literally only got that much money and you can't even save an extra $100 or $200. Because when you're buying a gaming laptop, I'm just of the opinion that you're probably going to be using it for multiple years. If you're going to be stuck with it, I think it's really worth saving an extra $100 to $200 because that will just make a big improvement to your overall experience over those years. So I understand what the GF63 is trying to do. I mean, there's got to be some gaming laptop that comes in at the lowest price, but yeah, compromises do have to be made. So with that in mind, I'm definitely not going to give it an F, but I think an E makes sense because there are just quite a few flaws with this laptop that are just going to happen due to that lower price point. Literally only consider this if it's the only thing you can afford and you want a game on a Windows laptop. Maybe you'll be better off with a console. Next up, we've got MSI's GP66, and this laptop offers excellent gaming performance. So I had mine with RTX 3070 Ti graphics, which were the same graphics as the more expensive GE67HX, but generally speaking, the performance in games was very similar. Now, my GP66 just had a regular 14-core 24-thread Intel 12th gen CPU, but there is also a HX version of the GP66 that came out later with that same 16-core 24-thread HX processor that is in the GE67HX. The GP66 is meant to be a more budget-friendly option compared to the higher-tier GE series though, so as a result, it's missing things like it doesn't have Thunderbolt, there's no OLED screen, there's no light bar on the front, it's got a lower quality camera, and it uses DDR4 memory rather than DDR5, which I suppose is cheaper. Still though, it's got good CPU and GPU power limits, and it has a mux switch. It performs very nicely in games, and the screen response time was quite good, so those things combined gives a great gaming experience. It's definitely a solid option if you can pick it up at the right price. Now, I think the GE67HX is superior due to those features that I just mentioned that the GP does not have. Based on that, I want to put it one spot underneath the GE and into B tier, but I'm worried that's a little underrated. Like, I could easily see this also being A tier for what it's offering, but I just find it hard to do it compared to the higher tier GE67, which I think is better. I don't know, I kind of think of the GP66 sort of like MSI's version of the ASUS Scar 15, and that's on B tier too. So yeah, it can stay as B for now. Next is MSI's Stealth GS77. So this is a 17-inch gaming laptop with Intel 12th gen CPU, and it's meant to be a more thinner design, as per the stealth name. It's kind of all black and yeah, got that stealthy look. Basically, I kind of think of it like a more budget-friendly version of Razer's Blade 17. It was still pretty expensive when I reviewed it though. Granted, mine did have RTX 3080 Ti graphics, and that was the major problem I had with it. The Blade 17 was much better, but obviously Razer laptops cost a lot of money. But when you're spending 3080 Ti money, the Blade 17 was only a few $100s more, and it just made more sense to get. This is a thinner laptop, but it had a lower GPU power limit of 75 to 105 watts for a 3080 Ti. And that Razer Blade 17 was not only thinner, but had the full power 150 to 165 watts on its 3080 Ti, so it performed much better in games. For some reason, the GS66 also does not have a muck switch, which is something that the smaller 15-inch GS66 has. Speaking of, I'll show the laptops that we've got coming up. Yeah, so GS66 is next up. For some reason, I also found that the fans would just randomly kick in when not really doing much, and that was a bit annoying too. If you really do want a thinner 17-inch stealthy all-black laptop, there aren't a whole lot of options out there, and this is generally cheaper than the only other option, the Blade 17. This laptop really failed to impress me though, and I'm gonna put it in E. I just don't think it's that great. I was kind of hyped for it when they announced it at CES at the start of the year, but yeah, it just wasn't that interesting. I'm also personally just not really a fan of the whole thinner design once you get to 17 inches, because although it's thin, I mean, it's still going to take up a lot of width and depth. And by that point, you've just got this big slab of metal, and I don't know, it just feels awkward. I don't know, I guess it wasn't that bad, but I mean, when I compare it to some other laptops in E tier that I wouldn't recommend people buy, like the Crosshair, I don't know, it kind of just fits right in. I guess maybe D or higher if you really want that stealth look. Next up is the smaller 15-inch version, which is the GS66. Now, I had this with a lower tier GPU than the GS77, so my smaller 15-inch GS66 had 3070 Ti graphics, while the 17-inch and bigger GS77 had higher tier 3080 Ti graphics. And in many games, the performance was very close together. So yeah, yet another example why it's not worth spending more money to get a 3080 Ti in a thin laptop. As mentioned, the GS66 does have a muck switch, which the 77 does not, so it does get that performance boost in games. The competition for the GS66 would be the Razer Blade 15, which we'll get to soon. The GS66 is definitely better value compared to the Blade 15. It's basically like a more budget-friendly option. Though that said, you are still paying more to get the thinner GS66 compared to other laptops that are a little thicker and offer better performance. So it really does depend on how much you want that thinner, all-black, stealthy design. Yeah, this one also didn't really impress me that much, but at the same time, I do think it's better than the GS66, so I think we've got our second in D tier. Next is MSI's G76. So this was literally the first gaming laptop I tested in 2022. And yeah, it had great gaming performance for a 17-inch laptop. That said, CPU performance wasn't that amazing out of the box, at least compared to other laptops. I've had thinner 15-inch machines that were able to perform better in multi-core. But like all of MSI's other laptops, you do get access to the advanced BIOS, so you can do a fair bit of tuning in there. And that's a great feature that's definitely a positive for every MSI laptop. Even the lower tier GF63 gets that as well, and I've got to at least hand it to them for that. And back to the G76. This is a bit more of a thicker design. I think it's at least on par with the GE67 right next to it, which is basically the refreshed 15-inch version of the GE76. And I think it's top-end enough to be in the same category as the SCAR 17 SE, plus all three of them have RGB light bars on the front, so I think A tier it is. This might be a bit controversial, but I think I'm going to put MSI's GT77 Titan as B tier. Now don't get me wrong, this is definitely the most upgradable gaming laptop of the whole year, but in order to fit all the extra things inside, it does end up being quite a bit bigger. And despite having a 16-core 24-thread HX processor like the ASUS SCAR 17 Special Edition, the SCAR beats it in CPU performance, despite being a smaller 17-inch laptop. Gaming and other workloads were fairly close together though. Not to mention the MSI does have way better BIOS support, as I just mentioned, so you could tune it far more than the SCAR. And also compared to the SCAR 17 SE and MSI's own GE76, the Titan GT77 has 2 more M.2 slots for 4 in total, and one of those supports PCIe Gen 5. There aren't really a whole lot of Gen 5 SSDs available today, but I guess technically speaking that is a bit more future-proof if I go go and use the F word. And the GT77 Titan also has 2 more RAM slots for 4 in total. And it's the only gaming laptop I reviewed this year that has 4 RAM slots and 4 M.2 slots. So like I said, the most upgradability. Those are definitely cool features, but I just don't think that they're for me. I wouldn't personally want such a big desktop replacement machine. Like I said before, I use laptops when I'm out and about. I need the portability. And this isn't something that I could fit in my bag and take with me. So I think that's why I'm giving it the B tier and putting it below the SCAR 17 SE and those other MSIs like the GE76. Now, as a desktop replacement for people that want to get into the advanced BIOS and tweak it, sure, absolutely. I could see it going at least A tier. If those are very important to you, then hey, maybe it's even S tier for you. But for me and what I do with my laptop, I think this makes sense for the GT77. Alright, next up is Razer's Blade 14. So I've got to think how this one stacks up against the other 14-inch laptops, which are the ASUS Zephyrus G14 that I put as an A, and the Alienware X14 R1, which I put as a C. Now, I did do a dedicated video comparing the G14 and Blade 14. The Blade 14 did have some advantages, but generally speaking, the G14 had way more benefits for most people while costing less money. So based purely on that alone, I'm going to say the G14 was better, which automatically means that the Blade 14 is a B at a maximum. Now, the Blade 14 has an AMD CPU and NVIDIA graphics, while that Zephyrus G14 also has an AMD CPU, but AMD Radeon graphics. So the Blade 14 does get the advantage of DLSS and FSR, while the G14 only gets FSR. Not to mention that NVIDIA generally has superior ray tracing performance. Yeah, the Blade 14 did have a better camera compared to the G14, a faster SSD, and it did feel nicer to the touch with that all-metal design. But yeah, otherwise the G14 had a better screen than the Blade 14. I thought its keyboard was nicer to type on. The G14 weighed less, making it more portable. The G14 has way more ports. The G14 also has better battery life. It's got better Wi-Fi, faster CPU performance, feels cooler to the touch under load, though the fans of the G14 could be a little louder, and the G14 has more upgradability. Sure, it's got some memory soldered to the motherboard, but at least it's got one memory stick. Both the Blade 14 and X14 have all memory soldered to the motherboard. Not only that, but the Blade 14 is limited to 16 gigs as a maximum for some reason, which I think is just stupid when you're spending this much money on a laptop that you can't upgrade. They really should have had a 32 gig option for people that wanted it. So yeah, that justifies why the Blade 14 is below the G14. Personally, I thought the X14 was ahead of the Blade 14 in many ways. It's got a better screen, for instance, and B tier just feels too high for a laptop that only has soldered memory and is limited to 16 gigs. I mean, come on. I think based on that, I'm gonna have to at least put it down one level to C tier, along with that X14. And yeah, it's definitely personal preference, but I think I liked some parts of the X14 more. As I said before, I just really liked how thin it felt. Though of course that does have other compromises. And the X14 only goes up to RTX 3060 graphics, while the Blade 14 also does 3060, but it also does 3070 Ti and 3080 Ti. I mean, its GPU does still have a lower power limit, as it is a smaller 14-inch design. And that 3080 Ti does definitely outperform the G14's 6800S in some games. But yeah, there are too many other negatives that I just don't think I can ignore, and it's not like C tier is particularly bad. Next is the slightly bigger Razer Blade 15, so the 15-inch version, though this is Intel CPU and NVIDIA GPU, and not AMD CPU like the smaller Blade 14. Now, my Blade 15 also had RTX 3080 Ti graphics, just like the Blade 14, but the performance was very close together. Now, that's either impressive for the Blade 14, but how I prefer to look at it is they're not getting the most out of the Blade 15. If they could tune the smaller 14 to perform about the same, then you would think with the extra space in the bigger 15 that they'd be able to get more out of it. That said, it did still run pretty well in games, but at the same time, its 3080 Ti graphics were getting beaten by cheaper laptops with the 3070 Ti. Like MSI's GE67HX, the Blade 15 did also get a mid-year refresh with an OLED screen, with that same crazy 0.6 millisecond response time. So from an esports perspective, that OLED panel could make it more worthwhile if you want the thinner laptop, because I don't think there are any other thin laptops with that 1440p 240Hz OLED screen just yet. Otherwise, the Blade had meh battery life as an Intel model, not too unexpected, and obviously as a Razer machine, it's very expensive. Razer positions themselves as a more premium brand and just asks for more money. I like to think of them as the Apple of the Windows gaming laptop world. I'd only really consider it if you have a lot of money and you care about looks and want that nice all-metal stealthy black design. You can definitely definitely get other laptops with better performance and better features for less money. So compared to MSI's GS66 right next to it here, I do think that the Blade is at least better than that, and I did compare those in a dedicated video. The GS66 is kind of the only other thin, stealthy 15-inch all-black gaming laptop that I tested this year. Putting it on the same level as the Blade 14 doesn't really feel right, given the Blade 14 can perform about the same in games. I suppose the 15 does also at least you upgrade the memory, so maybe that's enough to bump it above the Blade 14. At the same time, that lower performance I really can't put it any higher than C. If they actually utilized the 15-inch size well and it performed better than the Blade 14, then yeah, I could see myself moving it to a B, but at the moment, I think it's gonna have to go as a C. Next up is the larger Razer Blade 17. So as this is bigger than the Blade 15, it has a higher GPU power limit, which is what I would have expected from the Blade 15 compared to the 14, but apparently not. Anyway, the Blade 17 I tested had a 3080 Ti as well, but the gaming performance was actually substantially better as it was max power at 150 to 165 watts. Again, it had nice design and build quality, all black and nice feeling metal, but like I've said for other 17-inch laptops, although it's thin, in order to have that 17-inch screen, it's still gonna have to be fairly wide and deep. And just holding the Blade 17 in the hand, I don't know, it just feels weird holding this big huge chunk of metal. It's just not for me, even if my wallet could afford it. It also had poor battery life, and CPU performance wasn't great compared to other laptops with the same CPU. Single core CPU performance was actually quite low to other gaming laptops. Even AMD Ryzen 6000 laptops were able to beat it. And that wasn't happening in most cases with almost all of the other 12th gen laptops. Intel was almost always ahead of AMD. But with the Blade 17, for whatever reason, AMD single core could beat it. Not sure if that's just silicon lottery or just how the Blade 17 is. So again, both positives and negatives that kind of make it difficult to place above or below the other Blades. I mean, if you're looking at it purely in terms of gaming performance, it is definitely better than the others. So I kind of want to put it as a C, but due to that better gaming performance, I think I might have to give it the B. Because for a thinner design, I was actually quite impressed with how well it did in games. But again, definitely not cheap. Alright, those are my laptop rankings. Let me know what you would have done differently down in the comments. Just know that if you disagree with me, then you're wrong. Obviously, I'm just joking, but I am interested to hear what you would have done differently. Again, keep in mind this is a subjective list. There are definitely plenty of changes that I could have made up or down with plenty of laptops. And like I said at the start, just because I put something low doesn't mean you shouldn't buy it. There are just different laptops for different people. Now, if you want more details on any of these 36 gaming laptops, then check all the links below the video. I've got links to updated pricing for every single model, as well as links to all of my full review videos that go into way more depth. If you actually made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching, and to prove it, leave a comment down below.